In part 3 of this week's content, Power, Bodies and Technology, I'm going to draw on the work of Michel Foucault to think about a way of considering how power is implicit in everyday relations and comes to, in what Foucault calls, govern through freedom, a way of, a kind of contradictory way if you kind of take it at face value, but a notion that challenges agency and structure, critically engages with the very idea of choice, and kind of problematizes the very idea of the way that experts and knowledge, I suppose, provide us with values and ways of living, and the way that science does this as well. I'll be also doing a critical analysis of this in the fourth part of today's lecture around the work of Ulrich Beck and risk, society and individualization. But in the course we've been looking at the idea of power and more from more a hierarchical way, particularly Marx's idea has been prominent throughout the course so far. Foucault is not really a sociologist, more a historian, a philosopher, and kind of traces the ways that power and power relations change in society from what he calls sovereign power to disciplinary power. Now, in a kind of overgeneralized way, we can kind of express the difference of that of back in a few centuries ago when kind of royalty kind of ruled with an iron fist, they could kind of just say off with their heads as a way of kind of managing the population. Today, prime ministers, presidents and stuff like that, while still having control of the means of violence in society, tend to manage their populations more through economic management. So there's a similar relationship going on there in some ways, but for Foucault, much of the ways that power works today and the way that people are disciplined in society is through various knowledge practices, what he calls discourse, that I'll define more in a minute. So our efforts to keep healthy, to be productive, to be good citizens, good workers, those performances of the everyday self in that Goffmanist sense, the scripts we rely on, the experts that we follow, govern us through our freedom in this sense. Importantly here, what Foucault's talking about is that power comes to infiltrate more aspects in our lives in contemporary society. Back in the off with their heads days, while the kind of sovereign power had the ability to just kind of kill anyone they want and all that kind of thing, much of what was happening in day-to-day life was kind of out of sight, out of mind. People were off in their villages in kind of feudal systems doing their own thing and weren't really under the gaze of powered disciplinary mechanisms. In a more disciplinary society, which is what Foucault and Foucauldians see contemporary society as, people like experts, managers and technologies pervade everything that we do. And these instill kind of routines, habits, and forms of surveillance that kind of end up working as forms of social control. So, the key idea here is Foucault's notion of discourse. Colloquially speaking, discourse is just kind of communication back and forth, that kind of thing. And discourse has also become, I think, in post-Foucault way, used online. The discourse. But for Foucault, it's more a specific thing around knowledge systems and expertise. So discourse for Foucault is sets of widely accepted norms or ways of thinking about particular topics which are taken for granted in particular time periods or locales that are the product of expertise. So, very broadly, the medical industry kind of has sovereignty, I suppose, over what's healthy and how to treat sick people. Psychology about kind of mental health and improving people's mental health. The legal system produces, knowledge and laws about, what we can and can't do. Religion, another discourse around, values and morals and ethics. Politics in terms of civic life and the public sphere. These are different discourses, different areas of expertise that produce kind of knowledges, rules, scripts in relation to what we've been talking earlier on the course about how to live. So in many ways, these forms of knowledge keep us healthy, active, satisfied, entertain. But from a Foucauldian perspective, those things in terms of pursuing a good life are much about being productive, and much about kind of, being good workers and, turning up on time and being disciplined. The wellness industry in particular is something today that's kind of seen as like a way of kind of selling us all kinds of things for our particular ailments, whether they're physical or mental, nutrition and all these kind of things that seem more about being productive workers than being, say, an ethical person. So from this perspective, from this kind of Foucauldian perspective, these knowledge systems and our relations to them and the way that we, do or don't take on board what they have to say, kind of keep us under control, make us disciplined workers, what Foucault labels docile bodies. So there's a bunch of different examples, and we can talk about this in tutorials, but the prescription of drugs for mental health. So there's an increasing kind of thought in sociology and various philosophies that, if more and more of the population are experiencing depression and anxiety and these kind of mental health conditions, to the point where maybe, the majority of society are exposed to these things. Maybe it's society itself that's sick and not the individuals. But what's happening is, mental health professionals, prescribe drugs, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications and stuff like that to kind of keep us going, to kind of keep us happy. Some would say to kind of, keep us docile from this Foucauldian point of view. Now, in this example, it's really important I'm not saying that like those prescription practices and that medication isn't good for people, but from a more sociological macro perspective, we can ask these kind of broader questions about, why are we kind of pathologizing individuals when maybe it's society itself that's making us ill in this sense. There's a lot of Foucauldian perspectives used in the analysis of education systems, the way school curriculums privilege, numbers and kind of, being able to count over emotional intelligence, the way the prison systems kind of stockpile people rather than rehabilitate them. And I've already talked about the wellness industries and stuff like life coaches and personal trainers. Again, these, life coaches, personal trainers, going to the gym, they're ways of keeping healthy and, maybe living a longer life or whatever. But it seems that much of the reason to do these things are to be more productive in inverted commas. And from this perspective, that kind of speaks to kind of, capitalist production and stuff like that. So it's within these expert discourses that power and knowledge become integrated. From this perspective as well, this means that those kind of docile bodies that produce are kind of dominated and may produce and reproduce those kinds of forms of dominant relations. Importantly, though, and this is should not be overlooked in Foucauldian understandings of power, one of his most famous quotes is, "Wherever there is power, there is resistance." So in this sense, while things like expert discourses seem to be almost omnipresent and impossible to escape and provide us with these scripts to live that govern us through freedom, for Foucault, there's always kind of resistance to these things. Power is maybe kind of omnipresent in some senses, but we're not completely determined by it, completely overwhelmed by it. So an example of this bears out in Foucault's 3-volume work on the history of sexuality. There's actually been some more volumes of it produced after his death, even though he specifically asked his estate never to release those books. For Foucault, he analyzes the kind of way that homosexuality as a practice in the 19th century became increasingly under the gaze of expert discourses. And this, in many senses, regulated a form of sexual practice that before then was largely kind of, left alone, like, done out of sight, out of mind, and wasn't really thought about too much in terms of, public forums, maybe other than outside of religion. So medicine began, discovers homosexuality. How do we kind of treat this, in inverted commas, perversity? Treats it as an illness. Psychiatry treats it as a mental illness and even prescribes electroshock therapy to try and do something about it. Jurisprudence, legal systems make this kind of previously unregulated activity illegal religion sees as a sin. So these kind of expert discourses are central into making this practice seen as a form of perversity, under the gaze of increasing forms of social control, and inevitably violence and all kinds of forms of discrimination. So in that sense, that seems like a straightforward example of how discourse enacts forms of social control and discipline and regulation on people. But what happens once that form of almost labelling, back to the kind of Becker sense, happens? There's a reverse discourse that springs up. As the label sticks and as all these expert discourses kind of put it under the lens of social control, those that are kind of given that label can then use it to speak back on their own behalf, demand legitimacy, and try and, then remove some of those oppressions and laws and discriminations and marginalisations. So this is what Foucault then calls a reverse discourse. Power kind of is enacted on a particular subject, but then those subjects can kind of, organise, whether that's creating social movements, political parties, art, to try and do something about removing some of those disciplinary procedures. So in this sense, discourse at once both supports and subverts dominant power, because once that politics starts to work and the previously marginalised group maybe start getting removed some of those oppressions, there's a form of freedom opening up for those groups. So, medicine no longer treats it as an illness. Psychiatry doesn't treat it as a mental illness anymore. Most countries now have made homosexuality legal. Even some religions are starting to be less discriminatory against it as well. So again, these kind of things aren't static. So it's very important from this Foucauldian position to consider wherever there's power, there is resistance. I've mentioned technology a little bit so far. So, expert discourses are a key enactor of discourse. Foucault's also concerned with what he calls technologies of the self, and this is another way that disciplinary power is kind of enacted throughout society. So while expert disciplines kind of invade more and more aspects of our lives, so does technology, and this is particularly the case with things like smartphones, social media, apps, GPS, and all that kind of stuff that we're so saturated in today. And these kind of technologies go far beyond the kind of intrusions that Foucault could ever have imagined. Foucault died in 1984. What Foucault argues is that as we're kind of, embedded in these kind of technologies of the self, we live in what he calls a panopticon, and this is based on Jeremy Bentham's famous model of a jail, the most efficient jail, where there's a kind of tower in the middle, all the rooms, cells are on the outside, and so even if you're not being watched, the architecture of space there sets up a situation where you feel like you are, and then you therefore regulate yourselves as if you are being watched, and therefore, maybe misbehave less. Foucault takes this and kind of starts to stick it to think about how society works through many ways in a similar way. Expert discourses give us ways of being good, of being healthy, so we kind of regulate ourselves in that sense, but also technologies are constantly kind of nudging us to behave in certain ways. Things like, the realization that there's cameras around, so these regulate our behaviors. Certainly, social media is a really good way of thinking about the panopticon, the way that we know that our devices are tracking us more and more. Again, something like Facebook is totally volunteering for us to go on there. You don't have to do it, but many people choose to. But there's these disciplinary side effects beyond the kind of social interactions that happen on that make up this kind of panopticonic society that Foucault argues governs us through our own freedom. In future weeks, when I do the week on digital media, I'll look at aspects of this a little bit further around the idea of networked selves, the quantified self, and the cyborg. Donna Haraway's, what I think is a really useful concept for thinking about what human beings are today as kind of cyborgs, right? We carry this technology around with us all the time. Technology, even something like glasses, that are like kind of helpful for people that can't see that well, mean that like the very idea of what it means to be a human changes through the kind of use of those technologies. So in summing up here for Foucault, Foucault argues that expert discourses don't necessarily provide us with knowledge and truth and kind of ways of being well and smart and good and all that kind of stuff. They do provide those kind of things, but they also do then is kind of govern us by how that knowledge becomes a way of influencing our lifestyles, our choices, and the way that we interact with each other and behave in society in general. So you can see echoes of kind of the earlier socialization theories here, really governing through freedom. It's a kind of, in a way, a development of impression management and things like that, although what Foucault does is bring in the kind of ways that expertise becomes very important in terms of learning those scripts. Okay, I'll leave it there.